Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 14th chapter of the 6th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, its title being Flank Positions. The text follows. We have only allotted to this prominent conception in the world of ordinary military theory a special chapter in dictionary fashion, that it may the more easily be found. For we do not believe that anything independent in itself is denoted by the term. Every position which is to be held, even if the enemy passes by it, is a flank position. For from the moment that he does so, it can have no other efficacy but that which it exercises on the enemy's strategic flank. Therefore, necessarily, all strong positions are flank positions as well, for as they cannot be attacked, the enemy accordingly is driven to pass them by. Therefore they can only have value by their influence on his strategic flank. The direction of the proper front of a strong position is quite immaterial, whether it runs parallel with the enemy's strategic flank as Kolberg, or at right angles as Bunzelwitz and Drisse, for a strong position must front every way. But it may also be desirable, still to maintain a position which is not unassailable, even if the enemy passes by it, should its situation, for instance, give us such a preponderating advantage in the comparative relations of the lines of retreat and communication that we can not only make an efficacious attack on the strategic flank of the advancing enemy, but also that the enemy, alarmed for his own retreat, is unable to seize ours entirely. For if that last is not the case, then because our position is not strong, that is not an unassailable one, we should run the risk of being obliged to fight without having the command of any retreat. The year 1806 affords an example which throws a light on this. The disposition of the Prussian army on the right bank of the Saale might, in respect to Bonaparte's advance by Hof, have become in every sense a flank position if the army had been drawn up with its front parallel to the Saale, and there, in that position, waited the progress of events. If there had not been here such a disproportion of moral and physical powers, if there had been only been a down at the head of the French army, then the Prussian position might have shown its efficacy by a most brilliant result. To pass it by was quite impossible. That was acknowledged by Bonaparte by his resolution to attack it. In serving from it the line of retreat, even Bonaparte himself did not completely succeed, and if the disproportion in physical and moral relations had not been quite so great, that would have been just as little practicable as the passing it by, for the Prussian army was in much less danger from its left wing being overpowered than the French army would have been by the defeat of their left wing. Even with the disproportion of physical and moral power as it existed, a resolute and sagacious exercise of the command would still have given great hopes of a victory. There was nothing to prevent the Duke of Brunswick from making arrangements on the 13th, so that on the morning of the 14th at daybreak he might have opposed 80,000 men to the 60,000 which Bonaparte passed the Saale, near Jena, and Dornburg. Had even this superiority in numbers and the steep valley from the Saale behind the French not been sufficient to procure a decisive victory, still it was a fortunate concurrence of circumstances, and if with such advantages no successful decision could be gained, no decision was to be expected in that district of country, and we should therefore have retreated further in order to gain reinforcements and weaken the enemy. The Prussian position on the Saale, therefore, although assailable, might have been regarded as a flank position in respect to the great road through Hof. But, like every position which can be attacked, that property is not to be attributed to it absolutely, because it would only have become so if the enemy had not attempted to attack it. Still less would it bespeak a clear idea of those positions which cannot be maintained after the enemy has passed by them, and from which, in consequence of that, the defensive seeks to attack the assailant's flank, were called flank positions merely because his attack is directed against a flank, for this flank attack has hardly anything to do with the position itself, or at least is not mainly produced by its properties, as is the case in the action against a strategic flank. It appears from this that there is nothing new to establish with regard to the properties of a flank position. A few words only on the character of the measure may properly be introduced here. We set aside, however, completely strong positions in the true sense, as we have said enough about them already. A flank position which is not assailable is an extremely efficacious instrument, but certainly just on that account a dangerous one. If the assailant is checked by it, then we have obtained a great effect by a small expenditure of force. It is the pressure of the finger on the long lever of a sharp bit. But if the effect is too insignificant, if the assailant is not stopped, then the defensive has more or less imperiled his retreat, and must seek to escape either in haste and by a detour, consequently under very unfavorable circumstances, or he is in danger of being compelled to fight without any line of retreat being open to him. Against a bold adversary having the moral superiority, and seeking a decisive solution, this means is therefore extremely hazardous and entirely out of place, as shown by the example of 1806 above quoted. On the other hand, when used against a cautious opponent in a war of mere observation, it may be reckoned one of the best means which the defensive can adopt. The Duke Ferdinand's defense of the Weser by his position on the left bank, and the well-known positions of Schmottshausen and Landshut, are examples of this. The latter, it is true, by the catastrophe which befell Fouquet Corps in 1760, also shows the danger of a false application. So let's simply comment. So Von Clausewitz says about flank positions, we have only alluded to this prominent conception in the world of ordinary military theory, a special chapter in dictionary fashion, that it may more easily be found, for we do not believe that anything independent in itself is denoted by the term. So what's the deal with this? So every position which is to be held, even if the enemy passes by it, is a flank position. Right? It's simple as that. For from the moment that he does so, it can have no other efficacy but that which it exercises on the enemy's strategic flank. Right? The enemy simply passes it by, so decides not to assail it, and therefore it's passing its side, and it's exposing his own in the process, right? So this position has a value, right, for a flanking maneuver. But as we have seen also, especially from the previous chapter, therefore, necessarily, all so-called strong positions, as we have defined them in the previous chapter, are flank positions as well. Why? Because basically, Clausewitz says, as they cannot be attacked, the enemy accordingly is driven to pass them by, right? Therefore, they can only have a value by their influence on his strategic flank. We have seen that strong positions are basically these positions that are on the field, so not properly fortifications, but an arm that takes a position that can basically renders it sometimes through the help also of entrenchment, etc., but field fortifications, not more. Renders it is impossible, let's say, from a practical point of view, or for a terms of convenience, to assault them frontally, and or also entirely, right? This position basically is defined as the one that cannot be attacked from any side. So literally, the enemy says, okay, the discriminant here is the decision of the enemy whether to attack it or not, because technically every position is assailable if we look at it, asymptotically, but in the forces of war. But here it's determined mostly by the decision of the enemy not to assail it, to make it unassailable. This is maybe just an anecdotal question, but it's still important. So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that every position, practically, that the enemy passes by has this capacity of flanking the position. And every position that, at that point, the enemy passes, not because it's uninterested in it, but because he cannot attack it in the first place. So it can be a very strong one. Here we're talking about an army in a strong position. So what the enemy should technically take out in order to prevail in the campaign, right? During the campaign in the theater of war, is obliged, it cannot be attacked properly. So the enemy is making something dangerous, as much as your own army at that point in a strong position is doing something dangerous, as we will see why. Von Clausewitz says, the direction of the proper front of a strong position is quite immaterial. Whether it runs parallel with the enemy's strategic flank as Kolberg, or at right angles as Bunzelwitz and Drisse, for a strong position must front every way. But it may also be desirable still to maintain a position which is not unassailable, even if the enemy passes by it. Should its situation, for instance, give us such a preponderating advantage in the comparative relations of the lines of retreat and communication that we can not only make an efficacious attack on the strategic flank of the advancing enemy, but also that the enemy, alarmed for his own retreat, is unable to seize ours entirely. This is quite important, right? The enemy may bypass your position, as we've seen also, if he is maybe pressured by other factors that render even, at that point attacking you kind of a loss. Of time, for example. Maybe there is another threat that he has to cope with. So it's always a gamble, as any military decision. It can be a very risky one in the moment in which, by letting this army at your rear, your flank, you go on, and here this chapter is dedicated to the defensive. So we're seeing what can a defender do when somebody invades his country. So here the strong position is held by the guy who's defending, right? So he who attacks is the invader, and generally speaking, we have seen in the previous chapters, the invader has a lot of problems and should invading a country and should, especially controlling the territory, and it should be very careful in maintaining its lines of communications and retreat open. So automatically leaving his flank exposed to attack and to be cut out of his line of communications, well, it's pretty dangerous, right? Also, von Clausewitz says he may be so worried by this eventuality that he may actually not even, be so eager to attack us in turn. That is to say, this threat that you pose, maybe even with an inferior force, to his line of communications, may be so important that the enemy may be so concerned about that even if maybe he had the strength of attacking you, he would not do it because he's too concerned about this perseverance. Excuse me, I drink a little. So you can exploit this. It's obviously a moral question, but also a material one. That is to say, don't expose your flank is a pretty good advice. Because it says then, if that last is not the case, then because our position is not as strong, it is not an unassailable one, we should run the risk of being obliged to fight without having the command of any retreat. Right, so this was naturally in the evenience in which you're not actually holding a strong position, but you still equally are passed by for some reason. It can happen, and still with the risk of being attacked. So this is in practice, something that happens all the time, because as we've seen, even strong positions. What are strong positions? Can they be assailed or not? This is a relative problem because they technically all can be assailed. It's just sometimes sensible not to do it, for that matter. But it can't be, So von Clausewitz says the year 1806 affords an example which throws a light on this. The disposition of the Prussian army on the right bank of the Saal might, in respect to Bonaparte's advance by Hof, have become in every sense a flank position if the army had been drawn up with its front parallel to the Saal, and there, in that position, waited the progress of events. And Clausewitz says, if there had not been here such a disproportion of moral and physical forces, if there had been only a down at the head of the French army, then the Prussian position might have shown its efficacy by a most brilliant result. Right? This is a good example of how leadership can make the difference between a strong position and one that is not. Right? So that in this sense, in an indirect way, because at this point the French under Napoleon had this greater force, whereas they had a kind of a less resolute commander. That position would have been impossible, right? Clausewitz says, in fact, to pass it by was quite impossible. That was acknowledged by Bonaparte himself by his resolution to attack it. So you see what's the point that we were saying before. It's so strong that at some point either you break. This often happens in war. Yeah, that there is a situation you can't really escape. And this is true especially for the greater ones, right? The larger the armies, the more this comes to happen, because that's your enemy in front of you. So there are not many ways to pass it by for sensible strategical development to occur. So Clausewitz says, so the measure of this unassailability was the fact that it was assailed, and here we're talking about Napoleon, right? So definitely somebody who could do extraordinary things by definition. So Clausewitz says, in severing from it the little of retreat, even Bonaparte himself did not completely succeed, in fact. And if the disproportion in physical and moral relations had not been quite so great, that would have been just as little practicable as the passing it by. So, for the Prussian army was in much less danger from its left wing being overpowered than the French army would have been by the defeat of their left wing. Right. So, in a way or another, a different leadership would have brought to different results, because the Prussian position was so strong and apparently there wasn't really much you could do. Either you attacked it or you couldn't even basically pass it by. So Clausewitz says, even with the disproportion of physical and moral power as it existed, a resolute and sagacious exercise of the command would have still have given great hopes of a victory. There was nothing to prevent the Duke of Brunswick from making arrangements on the 13th, so that on the morning of the 14th at daybreak he might have opposed 80,000 men to the 60,000 with which Bonaparte had passed the Saal, near Jena and Dornburg. Had even this superiority in numbers and the steep valley of the Saal behind the French not been sufficient to procure a decisive victory, still it was a fortunate concurrence of circumstances, and if with such advantages no successful decision could be gained, no decision was to be expected in that district of country, and we should therefore have retreated further in order to gain reinforcements and weaken the enemy. Right. So this is an important lesson, because it shows at how at command level decisional process, eventually, what seems impossible very often is something you can't play on, in the sense that it seems, right? There is properly, as we were saying since the beginning, no situation that is literally unsolvable. The problem is that it's so unlikely so sometimes that you're going to say, but, well, why do I do it for? And that will, create important consequences, because here, yes, you're going to await reinforcements, but the enemy is going as well. There's a new strategic situation forming. So here, Von Clausewitz says Napoleon was lucky, because the situation was so serious, so the ground such in favor of the Prussians, and the numbers, and as well, that it's just this fortunate for the French series of circumstances that brought Napoleon to make it in the first place. Then Von Clausewitz says, the Prussian position on the Saal, therefore, although assailable, might have been regarded as a flank position in respect to the great road through Hof. But, like every position which can be attacked, that property is not to be attributed to it absolutely, because it would only have become so if the enemy had not attempted to attack it. Still less would it bespeak of a clear idea of those positions which cannot be maintained after the enemy has passed by them, and from which, in consequence of that, the defensive seeks to attack the assailant's flank. Were called flank positions merely because his attack is directed against a flank, for this flank attack has hardly anything to do with the position in itself. At least it's not mainly produced by its properties, as it is the case in the action against a strategic flank. That is to say, if by being bypassed you are in danger, so that you cannot maintain that position, and the reason being obviously because there is an army there that prevents you to, and does something terrible that prevents you either to retreat or whatever. At that point, you're attacking the enemy flank, but not it's just because you're positioned in that relation, not because you're actually exploiting the advantage that flank position actually provides you, because you're just basically hurrying up to get the hell out of there, hoping to defeat the enemy. And yes, there can be still some advantage deriving from the flank attack, but it's not the reason why you're doing it primarily. It's because you are freaking out, because you're being cat out, right? And you want to break through. Then Von Clausewitz says, it appears from this that there is nothing new to establish with regard to the properties of a flank position. A few words only on the character of the measure may properly be introduced here. We set aside, however, completely strong positions in the true sense, as we have said enough about them already. A flank position which is not assailable is an extremely efficacious instrument, but certainly, just on that account, a dangerous one. Because it's a bit reciprocal, right? Von Clausewitz explains, if the assailant is tracked by it, then we have obtained a great effect by a small expenditure of force, because we simply sit there, right, bringing the enemy to move and to decide to bypass us, so also exposing his flank. It is the pressure of the finger on the long lever of a sharp bit, but because literally you're exploiting the defensive, obliging the enemy to go your way, right? At least if that's what you wanted to achieve, to be bypassed. But if the effect is too insignificant, Von Clausewitz says, if the assailant is not stopped, then the defensive has more or less imperiled his retreat, and must seek to escape either in haste and by a detour, consequently under very unfavorable circumstances, or he is in danger of being compelled to fight without any line of retreat being open to him. Right? This naturally depends on what angles we're talking about. So Von Clausewitz here even says, strong position there, if you can't stop an enemy from invading you, is already a big deal, right? We have seen the 1806 example there. A sensible thing would have been for the French just to retreat and to wait for reinforcements. So that's all time both for the Prussians that are the defensive. So that would have been an important achievement. So strategically speaking, and we have seen that the defensive by itself intrinsically doesn't, is not passing to the offensive. So that may even happen at a certain point, but here the point is that you exploit the advantage of the ground of the position to essentially block the way to the invasion, right? So if the enemy passes you by, Von Clausewitz says, it's dangerous, that is to say, for you and for him, because chances are that if he passes by, especially if he really does, I mean, you're talking always at the main armies here. So those that are the big pieces, the big pawns in the game, right? There is, if one is knocked out, basically the battle, the game is won. Well, if he passes you by, most of the times it's because he doesn't fear you so much, and that you are probably the one who is losing something from it, because you're so insignificant that at that point the enemy is on your flank too, and it's actually on your rear at some level, because he has, compared to the line of advancement, he's going through, and you have, he is past you. So you are sometimes, not always, but usually cut out of part of your own line of retreat, or and or there is something that you have to calculate in there if the enemy has taken this decision no matter what, right? So what we see here is that it's not much reasoning by asymptotes, but realizing that in real war, if this happens, it's usually because you're probably, that position might have been not worthy for the enemy to storm it at that point, but still, you are not out of that position, away from that position, not that strong to be considered relevant, and even to be threatened by a flank attack. So it's a very concrete on the enemy, right, by the enemy, on him, I mean. So that it's quite relevant, it's quite concrete as an acknowledgement. So von Clausewitz says, then, against a bold adversary having the moral superiority and seeking a decisive solution, this means is therefore extremely hazardous and entirely out of place. This is in fact the conditions. If the enemy, is determined to go ahead and decides you are not so dangerous, it's because even yes, he's probably gambling high, but still because there is a high bid, that there is a high price there. So once that you would like to achieve as well, if the enemy has passed you by, strategically there's something wrong, usually, right? As shown by the example of 1806 above quoted, von Clausewitz says, in fact, you know how the campaign ended, and with the annihilation of Prussia. So, on the other hand, when used against a cautious opponent in a war of mere observation, it may be reckoned one of the best means which the defensive can adopt. Right, when the enemy is instead, trying to see what the hell is going on, and you place yourself in front of him, etc., you stop, and you you also shouldn't get overconfident by his position, but definitely you can exploit it, especially in time. I mean, at least there is this ability of that position to frighten the enemy a bit. Von Clausewitz says the Duke Ferdinand's defense of Devesa by his position on the left bank and the well-known position of Schmottseifen and Landshut are examples of this. On the latter, it is true by the catastrophe which befell Fouquet's corps in 1760 also shows the danger of a false application. So that there's never like the perfect man, the perfect move, let's say, but there is definitely the better one. And that is a big deal to spot in war at all times, and most of the times it's a matter of literally, move, counter move, and really, however, at some point needing to clash in a way, and there are certain situations you can't really avoid, right? So for now we stop here. This was a bit of a shorter chapter than the usual. Next one is pretty massive, telling the truth. We'll have probably to split it in part, but anyhow, we'll see it next time. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.